Ecology. What is ecology? Ecology is the study of the interactions that take place between organisms and their environment. It explains how living things affect each other and the world that they live in. Energy flow in ecosystems. So we're going to start today with looking at energy flow in ecosystems. So first we need to look at what an ecosystem is. An ecosystem is a combination of biotic factors such as living. So biotic means living. So if you look at the word and you take it apart a little bit, bio means life. So biotic factors are living things like plants and animals, scary or not, and abiotic. So when you put an A in front of it, it means opposite. So these are non-living. So you can think about apolitical versus political, or symmetrical versus asymmetrical. The A means not. So in this case, it's the same. Abiotic means non-living components. So that would be things like the weather, like lightning, or the water, for example. And so we're looking at a combination of biotic and abiotic components through which energy flows and materials cycle. So that's something to look at too. Energy flows. So energy typically starts from the sun, and then producers grab some of that energy, and then consumers, when they eat the producers, take some of the energy. But eventually that energy is all spread out. It's dissipated. So it's not lost, but it's certainly not usable once it's dissipated. Dissipated means it's spread out to the entire environment. Materials cycle, so that's totally different. So that means that the carbon that was in a dinosaur maybe is the same carbon that's in me now. And when I do cellular respiration and breathe out some of that carbon could be taken up by a tree. So the materials that are on the planet now are the same materials that were on the planet 100,000 years ago, except maybe for some radioactive decay. For the most part, it's the same. So some examples of ecosystems. Ecosystems are usually self-contained units, such as a pond. So here's a pond, and it's got a lot of sitting water. Or a swamp, and a swamp, I believe, has some more cover on it, but it still has a lot of standing water. Here's a meadow, so pretty, and a forest. So the differences between these ecosystems have to do with the amount of water that's present. There's also a certain amount of, well, one ecosystem to another will they'll be different by the amount of water that's in them or the temperature that's there. And then that will affect the plants and animals that can live there. So we're going to talk about energy source and flow. Energy in an ecosystem originally comes from the sun. Isn't that cute? There are a couple of very small ecosystems on the planet where the energy doesn't come from the sun. It will come from the thermal vents in the ocean, for example. But almost all of our ecosystems are really based on the sun, so that's what you need to know for me. Energy flows through ecosystems in one direction from producers to consumers. So the producers use the sunlight to make ATP and then glucose. And then consumers will eat the producers, and then other consumers will eat the other consumers. So producers make food, and they are things like plants and some protists. Because remember, some protists are like plants. And some bacteria. There are photosynthetic bacteria like, whoops, bacteria. There we go. There are photosynthetic bacteria like cyanobacteria. One thing that kids get confused with, fungi do not fit in here. They would fit in with consumers. So consumers use the food that the plants or other producers made by eating them or somehow taking them in. And so that's what a consumer is. So that brings us to food chains and levels of organisms. So you've probably heard of food chains before. Here's a typical food chain. The producer, like a flower, for example, is taking in sunlight and then storing that energy in glucose and starch in the plant itself. And then the caterpillar eats the plant, and so some of that energy goes to the caterpillar. So this would be the primary consumer. And then the frog eats the caterpillar, and so the frog would be a secondary consumer. And then the snake eats the frog, so that's a tertiary consumer. And then the owl eats the snake, so that's a quaternary consumer. So producers make their own food and use most of the energy they make for themselves. So the energy, though, can sometimes go to a consumer. The energy that's not used by the producers can sometimes be passed on to organisms that cannot make their own energy, like a giraffe. Whoops. And organisms that eat producers to get energy are called consumers. So first order consumers or primary consumers are these herbivores. So herbivores are plant eaters. So the plants make their own energy, they're producers, and then the ones that eat the plants are called herbivores or primary consumers. The primary consumers use most of the energy they get from the producer for themselves. But some of the energy moves on to the atmosphere as heat. And so that's dissipated, that's spread out, and the energy is never destroyed, but it's gone from the food chain. Some energy in the primary consumer is stored and not lost to the environment, or not used by the consumer itself. This energy is available for the next consumer. And so that would be the secondary consumer. A consumer that eats another consumer for energy is called a secondary consumer or a second order consumer. That can be a carnivore, or there are some omnivores, or it would be an omnivore, which is an organism that would eat both plants and animals. So an omnivore would actually be a primary and a secondary consumer. Could be a predator or could be a scavenger. So these will hunt and kill, whereas the scavengers will just eat what someone else killed. So they use most of the energy they get from the primary consumers for themselves, but some of the energy is lost as heat, and some of the energy is stored and can be passed on to yet another consumer. So a consumer that eats a consumer that already ate a consumer is called a third order or tertiary consumer. That can be a carnivore or an omnivore, and again, it can be a predator or it can be a scavenger. So here's a food chain. Here's the sun, and some of that energy is taken up by the producers, and then here's a primary consumer. Secondary consumer eats this guy, tertiary consumer eats this guy. So the transfer of energy from the sun to the producer to the primary consumer and then to a higher order consumer can be shown in what's called a food chain. And this is a food chain. Food chains show available energy. So for example, if you have 1,000 units of energy that the producers captured, it's called the 10% rule. About 10%, take off one of these zeros, about 10% of that energy is captured by these first level consumers. Then take off another zero, and about 10 units of energy are present in the secondary consumers. And, sorry about that, take out another zero, and you get about 1 unit of energy in these top-level consumers. So if you notice, you go down by a zero, by an order of magnitude at each step. And so a lot of that energy is just lost as heat at each step. And that's energy that's never going to be used by anyone else. So here's a food chain, here's the algae, and you would think of these really, if they were on land, as plants, but they are in fact protists. So this is the producer. Here's your primary consumer. Secondary consumer are the small fish. A squid, if they're eating fish, would be a tertiary consumer, and the shark would be the quaternary consumer in this case. So the producer traps sunlight and stores food. The first order consumer is the zooplankton, zoo for animal. The small fish are the second order consumer. So we're at the third stage, but it's the second order consumer because the first order consumer is eating the producer. And then next you get a tertiary or third order consumer. And then finally the fourth order consumer or the quaternary consumer. So here's another couple of examples of food chains. So terrestrial means land. So the producer here would be a plant. The herbivore might be some kind of, I don't know, what is that? I'm not really sure. Is that a bug? And then the carnivores are going to be eating the herbivores. So an herbivore eats plants and a carnivore eats other animals. So here's a mouse eating, or maybe it's a mole, I don't know, eating an insect, and then the snake eats the mole, and then the hawk eats the snake. Here's an aquatic food chain. You start with phytoplankton, and then you have zooplankton eating the phytoplankton, and then little fish eating the zooplankton, and then bigger fish eating the little fish, and then you have a whale actually eating the fish. Food webs are a little bit more realistic. So a more realistic path of energy through an ecosystem made of many food chains. So the food web was invented or the idea of the food web was invented because food chains really show just one path when there are really, really many, many paths available. So here's an example of a food web. So here's a producer, here's a producer. So here's a rabbit that can eat plants. And then the rabbit can get eaten by a fox, or it could get eaten by an owl. And then the grass not only gets eaten by the rabbit, but it could be eaten by the deer, or it could be eaten by the grasshopper. and sorry about that. And the tree could be eaten also by the deer. Here's a spider that gets eaten by a bird, and the spider actually is already eating a bug. So here's the crazy thing. Here's the producer that captures energy, and then there's the deer that eats the producer, and so that would be the primary consumer. And then this mosquito is actually eating blood from the deer, and then the mosquito is getting eaten by the spider, so that's the third order consumer. Excuse me. And then the bird is eating the spider, so that's the fourth, and then the owl would be the fifth order consumer here. But it's not always a fifth order consumer. So if you follow it backwards here, boom, 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 what is this one eating? So this chipmunk would be eating the tree, so that would be a primary consumer. And then if the owl eats the chipmunk, it would only be a second order consumer. So lots of organisms really don't exist just at one level, they exist at many levels. And so if you look at this and you think, it's kind of a lot of stuff here, you're right, it is a lot of stuff here because life is a little bit more complicated than just a food chain. Here's another food web. And so here are the producers, and then this one's maybe drawn out a little bit better. Here are all the things that eat the plants. So these are all the herbivores, or the primary consumers, and then the carnivores are shown throughout here. And here's an aquatic one. And so here's the plankton, and then you can see arrows leading away from the plankton. So the things that eat the so you're looking at energy flow. So energy starts with a plankton, and then the arrow goes toward the thing that eats it. So Daphne is a water flea. It's eating the plankton. Then it gets eaten by a tadpole. So a tadpole is an omnivore because it can either eat the bug or it can eat the phytoplankton. And here's another food web. And so these are just, you should look at them and say, wow, there's a lot to that. And there really is. So the hawk can eat the mouse, which eats the grass, or the hawk can eat the rabbit, which eats the grass, or the hawk can eat the snake, which ate the bird, which ate the grasshopper, which ate the grass. And that's all we have for food webs.